I arrived late to my son's mother-in-law's party because I stopped to help a millionaire. And the second I stepped onto her marble foyer, she decided to make an example of me. Crystal chimed. The scent of lemon polish and hot rosemary focaccia hung in the air, and every manicured head turned like I'd tracked mud across her Persian rug. Cynthia stood beneath her chandelier in silk, the color of champagne, lifting her glass with that tight Greenwich smile that never reaches the eyes. "Patricia," she chirped, loud enough to rattle the baccarat. "How brave of you to finally join us." My cheeks burned. The air conditioning hummed while whispers skittered between the charcuterie and the baby grand. I smelled gardenias and judgment. Emily avoided my gaze. My son Michael's jaw tensed as he took my elbow, the way you steady someone on black ice. I was windblown, a scuff on my sensible pumps, a smear of grease on my wrist I'd missed in the car mirror. "There was a Bentley on the shoulder," I said, voice steady. "An older gentleman shaking too hard to fix a tire." A man in seersucker snorted. Cynthia's smile sharpened. "Traffic, millionaires, there's always a story," she purred as laughter tinkled like the ice in her highballs. "I'll tell you exactly how I ended up on Route 1 with a trembling stranger and why I chose decency over punctuality, even if it cost me my place at her table. Because what happened on that shoulder would follow me through that front door, and the man I helped wasn't done with me yet. In a moment, I'll rewind to the hiss of hot rubber, the tang of gasoline, and the tremor in his hand when I dialed 911. And I'll show you how a late arrival turned into a reckoning none of us at Cynthia's perfect party saw coming. If you've ever been judged for doing the right thing, subscribe and stay with me for the whole story. My name is Patricia, and there are days when the past and present lie so close together I can feel the heat of both on my skin. In Cynthia's marble foyer, with the hum of the air conditioning and the clink of ice and crystal, I felt them press against each other like panes of glass. I stood there with my wind-blown hair and a scuff on my sensible pumps, the lemony shine of her floors almost winking up at my image, 50 shades of not belonging. Cynthia's smile, tight as a bow you'd rather not untie, hovered under her chandelier. "Patricia," she sang. Not Patty, not Mrs. Anything. Just the syllables of my name made into a little bell she could ring in front of her friends. I could smell the gardenias from her side porch, that thick sweet that always makes me think of corsages at high school graduations and ladies with hats at St. Mary's. There was rosemary tucked somewhere too, that focaccia making the whole place smell like a Tuscan postcard, only the postcard never included a woman like me at the edge of the rug with a smear of grease on her wrist. Emily would later tell me I should have gone to the powder room first, caught my breath, rinsed my hands. But how could I think about a powder room when I had driven the rest of the way with that man's tremor in my memory, the heat of the July shoulder still trapped behind my knees, and the call to 911 only just fading from my ears? My son, Michael, touched my elbow, his jaw tight enough to leave a mark. It was the kind of touch you give a person crossing black ice, steady but embarrassed that they needed it. "Traffic, millionaires. There's always a story," that man in seersucker said, chuckling toward his glass as if it were a co-conspirator. I saw the way they all looked at me. The watchful women in silk, the men in jackets the color of summer sky, the young ones with phones in their palms like extra hearts. It would have been easier to lower my eyes, apologize for the inconvenience, let my lateness be the whole story. But the truth had heat and rubber and the smell of gasoline, and it began miles back on Route 1, when the world was bigger than this room and decency had asked for my time. That morning had been like most mornings since I retired, quiet, small pleasures lined up like spoons in a drawer. I took my coffee on the back stoop, the blue mug chipped at the lip, and listened to the cicadas in the maples behind the condo. The sun had just found the edge of the neighbor's siding, the kind of old clapboard you only see in towns like mine, with a history that doesn't mind peeling. I watered the basil in the terracotta pot and pinched the tops to make it bush. Michael says I fuss over plants the way I fussed over him when he was little. But I say fussing is just a fancier word for noticing. I noticed the way the light came through the leaves like stained glass. I noticed the robins, their shoulders working. I noticed the way the day felt like it might be kinder than it needed to be. I had laid out the dress the night before, the navy one with the polka dots you could mistake for stars if you wanted to be romantic about it. I put on my pearl studs, the ones from my mother, the ones I wore to Michael's graduation, and when he married Emily in that ivy-covered church in Old Greenwich, where the organ made the floorboards hum. I wrapped the lemon bars I'd made for the party, my old recipe, the one with the shortbread crust you press in with your fingertips, in saran wrap and nestled them in a plastic carrier with a little crack on the side. I never arrive empty-handed to anyone's house. My father used to say, "We may not have much, kiddo, but we've got manners." And manners to me include sugar and butter cut into slow crumble, includes standing at your counter and zesting lemons until your fingers smell like summer. Greenwich is 15 minutes and a lifetime from Norwalk, where I live, depending on which lane you're in and what your last name sounds like. I pulled down into Route 1, the post road with its chain stores and gas stations and the old places folded in between, and let the radio do its thing. On days like that, I think about the years that string behind me like the flags that flap over the car lots. I think about the desk at the elementary school where I sat for 32 years. The way the kids poured in every morning with their hair damp from hurried combs, their voices pressing over each other like waves. I was the one who iced scraped knees and stood on the front steps when a parent was late, hands in my sweater sleeves, scanning down the street until headlights made the corner. There were times I felt I lived at that desk with the lost mittens turned into puppets and the PTA sign-up sheets that never filled themselves. There were years of coloring contests and book fairs and the stubborn nobility of copy machines that would fail only when your deadline had a pulse. Every extra hour I took, afternoons in the cafeteria when they were short, evenings supervising the school play's ticket table, was tuition for Michael's future. I ate standing up in the teacher's lounge, counted coins for the field trip jar, stashed my lunch money in envelopes with handwritten notes I'd later hand to a mother with a tight smile and loose change. When Michael wanted trombone lessons in middle school, I said we would figure it out, and then I figured it out by selling the bracelet my ex-husband had given me the summer he spotted me on Coney Island with my hair in a scarf and a coat of cherry lip gloss. He went out the door when Michael was 10 with apologies that sounded like the clink of dishes left in the sink. It wasn't brave to keep going. It was just what you do when someone needs you. You fold up your own wants like winter blankets and put them on the top shelf. You make room for other people's shoes by leaving yours at the mat. I tell you all that not because I'm some kind of saint, but because the muscle memory of mercy is real. And it's the reason my hands turned left when I saw the Bentley with its hazards blinking, hunkered half in the grass just before the bend by the Veterans Park. The car was the color of rain clouds, the kind people say are understated when what they mean is expensive. Its hood was up, and there was a man standing beside it in a pale blue shirt that clung to his back. He had a lemon-yellow handkerchief crumpled in his fist and a look that I recognized from behind the front desk on days when someone had news they were trying to hold in with their teeth. I pulled onto the shoulder, gravel ticking under my tires, and put on my hazards just like they taught in driver's ed back in '76. I'm not the kind to fly out of the car without a plan. The first thing I did was check the traffic, safety before heroics. Then I got out my canvas grocery bag because in it I keep everything. A flashlight, a bottle of water, a little first aid kit with bandages and aspirin, wet wipes, a folded-up picnic blanket that has seen more soccer sidelines than picnics. The air hit me hot and thick. The sun had been drinking from the sky all morning and was half drunk on it. "Sir?" I said, the way I've said it to men of all kinds, from the principal with a bouquet of excuses to the UPS driver whose pen never worked. "Are you okay?" I think so," he said, and his right hand shook like a leaf caught between two breezes. He was older, a kind of handsome that had the plating rubbed off, maybe around 70. His hair was white at the temples, and his cheeks had that red you get when you're trying not to make a scene. There was a tire iron leaning against his calf like a fallen walking stick. "Damn thing," he said, then caught himself and gave me an apologetic smile that reached only halfway. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," I said. "You don't have to be steady to be sorry." His breathing was shallow, too quick, the way people breathe when their nerves have taken them hostage. "Come sit," I told him, nodding toward the curb. I spread the picnic blanket anyway, a flap of plaid between him and the gravel, the kind of grace I've been grateful for myself when life puts you on the ground. He looked at the Bentley like it had betrayed him. "I should be able," he started. "You should be able to keep breathing," I said. "That's the job right now. Everything else is extra credit." I put my water bottle in his hand. He hesitated, then drank. There was a faint chemical smell, that hot rubber scent mixed with gasoline, and behind it, the cut grass sweetness of the park. His fingers, despite the tremor, were elegant. There is no other word. He had a watch the color of a wedding band, a dial as clean as a tennis court. "Thank you," he said. "I'm Arthur." There are names that aren't just sounds. They're neighborhoods and schools and stories. Arthur said Arthur, and somewhere a valet picked up a set of keys. I was just Patricia, which is enough for me. "Patricia," I said back, because if you sing your own name, sometimes you can make it feel like armor. "I'm going to call for help." "I didn't want to be a bother," he murmured. People like him rarely assume they are a bother. People like me have made a life of minimizing our footprint. It was strange to hear that sentence from his mouth, but fear will make you borrow anyone's voice if it gets you through a moment. "That's the trick," I told him, my fingers already on my phone. "You decide to bother someone when you need them." I dialed, gave the details. The operator's voice was crisp and calming. Someone would be there soon. I asked Arthur if he was dizzy. He shook his head no. His hand shook yes. I got him to chew an aspirin from my kit just in case, more ritual than remedy, and asked if there was anyone I should call. "My assistant," he said after a moment, then hesitated. "No. She will make too much of this." He gave me a number anyway, and a last name that, later, would make people's eyebrows go up around me like awnings in the rain. We sat there in the heat, him occasionally pressing that handkerchief to his forehead, me kneeling in the shadow of his car enough to catch the smear of grease I wouldn't see later. A man in a pickup slowed, rolled down his window, asked if we were good. I lifted my palm. "Help's coming," I called. He nodded, made that little salute I have always loved, the two fingers against the brow, as if people on a roadside were a kind of flag you honor as you pass. "Do you live nearby?" Arthur asked me. It was the kind of small talk people make when their world has tilted and they want it to settle. "In Norwalk," I said, "just past the old bakery that turned into a nail salon." He smiled, which felt like a relief. "I'm on my way to a party." I said it and thought about the lemon bars in the passenger seat, the top layer dusted with powdered sugar like a first snow. They were safe at least, my one gift not rattled by this detour. "A party," he said, tasting the word. "A good one?" I laughed. "We'll see. It's a whole to-do for my son and his wife. Her mother throws nice things." It was the kindest word I could find that didn't require a long explanation. Nice as a wall hanging you by at Target. Nice covers a multitude of sins. "My wife liked to throw gatherings," he said. "Before she got sick, I was always tripping over caterers in my own house. People would thank me for the flowers, and I would say, 'I just cut the checks.' It wasn't my taste. But you do things for the people you love." He said it, and something small and heavy knocked gently in my chest. "She passed last year," he added, almost as an aside, like when you cross out a line on a grocery list after you've put the milk in your cart. "I'm sorry," I said, and I was. Loss recognizes loss. It doesn't matter the zip code. I reached out, touched his sleeve, and he let me. We sat in silence for the last few heartbeats before the tow truck turned slow into the park entrance, lights flicking. The driver was one of those young men who look like every boy you've ever reminded to wear his jacket. He had a tattoo that peeked out from his collar, a mess of lines that might have been a name. "You're lucky she stopped," the driver said to Arthur after I explained. Most folks would keep going and tell themselves they didn't see it. He winked at me like we had a secret. I watched him work, quick and certain, and I felt that small lift in my chest I always feel when a problem finds its person. We signed papers, there was grease and hydraulics, and the choreography of competence. I could have left when the tow truck pulled the Bentley onto the flatbed, but I didn't. It felt wrong for me to be the first to leave. I have learned not to step out of a room until the person who needs me does. Before he climbed into the cab, Arthur fished in the glove compartment and pulled out a small cream-colored card. He put it in my hand with a care that made it feel like something more than paper. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "That's the trouble with gratitude. It feels bigger than whatever you can do in return." "You just say it and mean it," I said. "That's enough." He looked at the card like he wasn't sure. "In case," he said. "In case what?" I didn't know. "In case the world was kinder than you expected." I slipped the card into my purse, between my checkbook and a stack of stamps with birds on them, and then I drove the rest of the way to Old Greenwich with my heart beating too close to my mouth. On Sound Beach Avenue, the banners for the sidewalk sales fluttered a little, and mothers pushed strollers with balloons tied to their handles. I passed Ada's Kitchen and Coffee and thought for a second about stopping to wipe the grease off my wrist to wash my memory. Instead, I turned onto the street with the lawns like carpets and the hedges that looked as if they had contracts with someone's scissors, and let my tires kiss the curb outside Cynthia's house. From the outside, her home is the kind that makes people say, "Must be nice," even while swallowing the bitter part. White clapboard, black shutters, a porch that holds its breath because it knows it should. The brass knocker is a pineapple, but it's more decorative than welcoming. I could hear laughter as I walked up the brick path, the murmur of voices that knew their own names in the right rooms. I straightened my dress as I stepped into that foyer, and then everything contained me. The cool air, the smell of lemon, the judgment coiling polite and tight. That first barb, how brave of you, hung above us like a ribbon you lift with scissors. Michael's fingers tightened. Emily hovered beside her mother, her lips the color of raspberries, looking down at her clutch like it contained instructions. I smiled the way you smile when your dentist says there will be some pressure. The servers in black floated by, eyes careful not to land on my wrist. The grand piano to my right had a book of show tunes open, the kind that have the words "Old Money Hums" in the shower. I saw the name cards on the dining table in the next room, little tents of calligraphy, and the way Patricia had been placed near the swinging door to the kitchen. It made me smile. Another kind, the rueful kind. Near the kitchen is where I've always lived, if you think about it. Some people only see the world from the head of the table. Some of us know the view from the dishwasher, too. Cynthia came toward me then, her perfume expensive and ladylike, her chin lifted in a way that makes you want to check your own. "We started without you," she said, as if that were an act of mercy toward me instead of an inconvenience to her. "I helped someone on the road," I said. "I didn't make it long. I didn't make it heroic." He had a flat and a tremor. Her eyebrows collected toward each other, polite concern shading into amusement. "Oh, Patricia," she said, "that's very civic." She tilted her head, the way birds do when they're not sure if what they're looking at is edible. "You should have called. We could have saved your place at the end." "I'm here," I said. "That's another thing I've learned. Sometimes the best you can offer the world is your presence." So I offered it, with the lemon bars, which I held out like a peace treaty. "For the table." "Lovely," she said. She took them with both hands, as if they might stain her. "We have quite a spread, but I'm sure the boys will appreciate something. Homey. Homey. It's a word that can wear an apron or a sneer." In her mouth, it was pressed and starched and hung on a line where everyone could see. She handed the bars off to a young woman in black, and I watched them go. Would the plastic carrier return to me? Would it disappear into one of those cabinets that echo when you open them because they're models, not kitchens? I imagined my lemon bars cut into dainty squares, their sugar dusted to perfection, my little offering becoming elegant against its will. It was silly, but it pinched at something in me. My food, in a house like this, has always been a translation. "Ella Fitzgerald in the background?" the man in seersucker mused to his companion near the piano. "Someone should tell the girl on the mic to stick to standards." The girl, who couldn't have been more than 20, sang "It Had to Be You" with a brightness that made me think of prom nights and borrowed shoes. I wanted to stand beside her and hum harmony just to give her something to lean on. Instead, I stood beside my son and felt him trying to be in two places at once, on my side and on theirs. I wish I could tell you I'm immune to rooms like this. I wish I didn't feel the old story press in. Me, with my sensible shoes and my sale rack dress, my thank yous and I'm sorries stacked like Tupperware in a cupboard. But I'm human and 66 and still susceptible to a kind of quiet that makes your stomach flutter and your mouth dry. These are not my people. They just happen to know and love my people, which is enough to make me show up, sugar in a box and pearls at my ears. We found our way to the table, and I found my name near the door as predicted. When I pulled out my chair, the server behind me had to sidestep, and the plates rattled like a warning. Across from me sat a woman with a sheet of hair and a diamond the size of a gumdrop. "You must be Michael's mother," she said with the brightness people turn on when they approach someone they think might not understand how lamps work. "Cynthia says you worked in a school." "I did," I said, and because I am proud of it, I let the warmth in my voice be heard. I was the secretary. The kids called me Mrs. P. Some of them still send me holiday cards. "How sweet," she said, "the way you talk to a toddler whose rainbow is mostly brown." "I always thought it must be hectic." She dropped her fork with a soft clank. "I don't have the patience." "You find it," I said, "or it finds you." The seersucker man leaned in and said something about the post road and "our good Samaritan here." And the table tittered. That word, Samaritan, always feels like someone's trying to upgrade decency to sainthood so they can keep avoiding doing it themselves. Between courses, I saw Emily's face more than her voice. She was everywhere and nowhere, a blur of bridal grace, refilling glasses with a few kind words, making sure napkins were where they belonged. She is a good girl with good manners and a mother who can turn kindness into a scoreboard. She flickered into a chair at our end for a minute and squeezed my hand under the table. "Mom's on one," she whispered, a half smile cutting the comment. I squeezed back. "I might have a story too," I whispered. Her eyes flicked with curiosity, but there were canapes that needed to be patted and toasts that needed to be staged. It was during Cynthia's first toast. She stood and lifted her glass with that sunlit smugness of someone who has never wondered if there would be enough, when the soft chime of the doorbell threaded through the room. She paused, her arm raised. The servers looked at one another like pigeons deciding who would take the can. Somewhere in the foyer, a murmur, shoes on tile, a note of surprise that even the candlesticks could hear. Cynthia held her glass halfway between her lips, and God. "We'll just," she began. And then there he was in the doorway, moving carefully as if time were a carpet with edges that might trip him. Arthur. His hair, smoothed back, good suit to replace his sweat. He had a different handkerchief now, crisp as a folded letter. If rooms have pulses, this one skipped. I heard whispers, "Bellamy, that's him, Round Hill Club, the symphony." The money in Greenwich knows the money in Greenwich even better than it knows itself. He didn't see me at first. He saw Cynthia, which is what rooms like this are designed to make happen. He saw the chandelier throwing light like confetti. He saw the gatekeepers with their smiles stapled on. "My apologies," he said to the room as if it belonged to him, which in a way it did. Men like Arthur carry deed-like gravitas in their breast pockets. "I am interrupting." Cynthia's smile returned in a dozen resplendent pieces. "Arthur," she said, hands floating up like birds. "What a surprise. We weren't expecting—" "I wasn't either," he said gently. "I was expected elsewhere." His eyes traveled then, not hurried, and found me near the kitchen door where I fit. "But I met someone on the road this morning who insisted on keeping me breathing, and I felt compelled to return the favor in the only way I know how." He smiled then, the real kind, the kind that loosens a room. By being present. The clink of glasses ceased, like metal inhaling. Cynthia's eyes flicked from him to me, and I watched the math in her head, the quick slide rule of what this meant for her party, her story, the narrative she had already laid out like silverware. I felt the blood in my face, not shame, but the opposite, pride that burned pleasantly, a flush I would tuck away for winter. I stood because not standing would have been a way of staying small, and I have already done my time bending lower than my real height. "She found me on Route 1, Arthur said, his voice even, with my car sulking and my hands not entirely my own. We make a lot of noise about people these days, about who is decent and who is not, but I will tell you there is decency in a woman who keeps a sprint in her purse for strangers." He held up his hand as if someone might protest. "And for those who will wonder, no, I didn't tell her my name right away, and no, she didn't ask. She helped me because the world had put us in each other's way. I came to say thank you, to make sure the room she walked into would be as generous to her as she had been to me on the shoulder. People do a certain thing with their faces when power shifts. They try to adjust their lighting." Cynthia's smile faltered in a micro of a second, and then rebooted. "Well," she said, and her voice did that little high skip. "This is something. Patricia was just telling us her adventure." She plucked the word from a vase, trimmed it, made it fit. The room laughed the way rooms laugh when instructed. Arthur moved toward me. His steps were purposeful, but slow. He had, I noticed, a cane cap on his shoe, one of those rubber nibs doctors recommend when you've taken a fall. He stopped beside my chair. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the empty seat next to me, someone else's no doubt momentarily abandoned. I nodded. He lowered himself with the care of a man whose body had recently reminded him of its limits. Up close, he smelled faintly of eucalyptus and something else, something like starched cotton. "Thank you," he said, softer. "You could have kept driving." "All my life I've been stopping," I said, with a small smile I didn't have to manufacture. "It's a habit by now." "Do not let them cure you of it," he said, eyes flicking toward the chandelier as if it were a person you might have to keep an eye on. Cynthia recovered. She did what women like her do when they feel the control slipping. They tighten their grip around something else. "Well then," she said brightly, "let's all raise a glass to neighborliness." She emphasized the last word, which made it sound like some of us weren't. "To Patricia's generous heart and Arthur's continued good health." She excelled at making toasts that didn't drip too much honey. She glanced at me with a message that wasn't in her words. "You might have your little moment, but remember whose house this is." I lifted my glass and let the bubbles tickle my upper lip. My son finally exhaled, and it sounded like gratitude. Emily's eyes were wet, but she blinked it away with a skill learned in other rooms. The girl at the piano started cheek to cheek, a little shaky at first, then surer. I took a bite of the salad, arugula and thin slices of pear, and tried not to think about whether my lemon bars had made the cut to be put out in the next room. Between mouthfuls and murmurs, Arthur leaned in, his voice low. "I don't mean to be dramatic," he said, "but I think you may have saved me from something ugly this morning. There are little wars our bodies wage without telling us, and you have a way of seeing them. Were you a nurse?" "School secretary," I said, because that's the truth. But there's more to a job than its name. You learn things. You learn when a child's fever isn't about their temperature. You learn to keep Band-Aids in your pocket and good words in your mouth. He nodded. "I am creating a fund," he said, out of nowhere and exactly from where he lives. "It's for practical kindness. That may sound hokey." He smiled at his own word choice, like a man trying on jeans in a store that doesn't carry his size. Grants for school secretaries who buy winter coats, for cafeteria ladies who quietly slide extra milk into backpacks, for the people who leave rooms better than they found them. "I would like to put your name on it." I choked. Not on a leaf, but on a life that sometimes feels too much and sometimes feels like not enough. "That's..." I started. My own ears sounded far away. "You could put anyone's name on that, Arthur. Today I'm choosing yours," he said simply. And then, because he is not only kind but savvy, he lifted his voice just enough for the nearby tables to hear. "I hope I may talk to you about it later, Patricia, if you'll allow an old man to borrow your wisdom." I glanced up and saw Cynthia registering this new reality. Her good silver of a party had a new place setting she hadn't accounted for. She smiled toward us, 2 parts gracious, 1 part calculating, all parts sparkling. The man in seersucker looked at me differently then, as if I had grown a new accessory. The woman with the gumdrop diamond blinked. I lifted my napkin and patted my mouth. There are worse things than being judged. There is being judged by people who will never make space to learn the story that came before the second you stepped in late. I felt the rooms of my memory open. The one where I stood in the school hallway with a girl whose backpack smelled like cigarettes because her mother's new boyfriend smoked in the living room. The one where Michael and I ate cereal for dinner and called it a treat because the electricity bill had done a number on us that month. The one where a woman from my church handed me $20 in the parking lot with only the words, "No need to thank me." The one where I cried in the shower so Michael wouldn't think I was afraid. The one where I stayed up all night making cupcakes for a class party because the mother who had signed up had a shift and a headache and a calendar that was not her friend. Those rooms make you find your own height. They make you remember that your place at the table has always been half pulled out in the room next door, and you've been sitting there happily because it meant you could get up quickly to refill someone's water. They make you understand that people like Cynthia will always see your lateness more than your miles. After the toast and the clinking and the small applause that follows anything that sounds like innovation, the party resumed its rhythm. Conversations braided and unbraided, plates were lifted, plates were replaced. I heard snippets as if I were walking past radio stations on a summer night. Sotheby's, second homes, the new Pilates studio in Riverside, whether or not to send the au pair back to Sweden after August. I have learned to listen without letting my blood pressure rise. It is a skill like any other. You use it to keep the peace. Cynthia glided by my seat, her hand hovering over my shoulder the way a teacher's used to before she corrected your grip on a pencil. "Patricia," she said, lemon tucked into her smile. "Perhaps next time you might put my number into that phone of yours. That way, when civic duty calls, I can make adjustments. Communication is the backbone of a successful anything." Her eyes flicked to the lemon bars that had finally appeared on the dessert sideboard, squares neat as soldiers. "And thank you for the sweets. We have the most wonderful bakery in town. You must try it. Although, of course, there is something charming about a homemade touch." I looked up at her. I felt the wear of years like a well-loved sweater against my arms. "I didn't stop to help him because I expected applause here," I said, quiet enough to be mine. "I know the difference between a good deed and a performance." She considered that and then smiled with her eyes, the way walked-on people do when they're deciding whether to let a heel make contact again. "Of course," she said. "We're all just doing our best, aren't we?" She drifted on, arms open to receive the next compliment. I looked down and watched a line of ants find a crumb under the table, and I felt a strange sympathy. Even in a room where nothing was meant for them, they found something to carry away. Later, Arthur stood and made conversation with the hosts as if he had been invited all along. He had that ease, cultivated or not, of someone who had never been told to wait in a vestibule while the table was being set. People approached him with the kind of affection that has money threaded through it, that warp and weft of charity and belonging. He nodded. He made promises he could keep because he had built those very bridges himself. And then he returned to me. "I am not done, Patricia," he said quietly, and the sentence made my shoulder blades settle. "I am not done being grateful to you or asking you to think bigger about your kindness." He smiled. "You said you're from Norwalk. Do you know Mrs. Strickland at Jefferson School?" I laughed. "Know her? She's the one who trained me. She taught me how to corral 31st graders with only a bell and a look. I funded their new library wing," he said. "We will need someone to advise us on what the kids really need. Not the wish lists the adults make to impress each other. The kids' lists. Would you help me ask them?" I felt something in me unclench that I didn't realize had been tight. The picture of myself at a long table with a pad of paper, listening again to small voices, felt almost like a prayer. "I'd be honored," I said. There was a moment then, unmoored from the party, where it was just an old man and a not-so-young woman, and a stack of years between them, and the idea that life can still surprise you with a good thing. But the world rarely lets anything sit quietly for long. The double doors opened toward the patio, and the summer air reached in like a neighbor. A server placed a tray of coffee cups near me, and a cup tipped, a ribbon of dark liquid landing in a neat stripe across my lap. There was a chorus, "Oh no," and napkins, napkins, and someone's voice chirping with bright control. Cynthia materialized with a cloth, as if she had been waiting in the wings for a prop. "I've got it," I said, half standing, patting my dress with the corner of my napkin. Arthur rose, too, as much as he could, an instinct that reminded me why I had stopped for him in the first place. The server, cheeks crimson, whispered apologies. I looked at him the way I would look at any child who made a mistake while trying to do their job and said, "It's just coffee." Cynthia's cloth smelled faintly of lemon. "These things happen," she said, with a too bright sympathy. "You know, we have a seamstress. She's brilliant with stains." She dipped the cloth and dabbed in a precise little motion on my thigh, the gesture half intimacy, half control. I gently took the cloth from her and took care of my own skirt. "I'll handle it," I said. "Not with bite, but with the firmness you use when you want the world to know your own body is your own business." I saw the flicker in her eyes again, that click of a lock you put on a door that is already closed. Arthur cleared his throat. "Cynthia," he said, a note that said he had known her long enough to be kind and long enough not to be fooled. "I would like to propose a second toast. Not now," he added quickly to save her sense of timing. "In a bit. Something small." He touched his jacket pocket. "I believe I have something for Patricia." Cynthia's lips tightened and then spread like ice on a pond, thin and glittering. "Of course," she said, which meant, of course. "Let's all make sure we have a piece of dessert for that." It was the kind of graceful maneuvering I have learned from women like her. If you can't stop the tide, you set out your best towels and pretend you invited the waves. I excused myself to the powder room then because I had a stripe of coffee cooling on my lap, and because bathrooms are where women go to gather themselves. In Cynthia's powder room, the towels are embroidered and the soap is shaped like shells, blessed objects that people are afraid to touch. I hung my purse on the little hook behind the door and took a damp cloth to my skirt, breathed in deep through my nose the little lemon and lavender sigh of that room. In the mirror, my face looked like my mother's for a second, the way it does, and I thought about her hands in our sink, scrubbing a shirt before church. "Let nothing sour linger," she used to say, and she never meant just the stain. When I came back out, the music had shifted to something lively enough to fill the patio. Children had appeared magically from somewhere, a pair of them chasing each other around the hedges, a little girl with a bow exuberant enough to have its own zip code. Emily was on the flagstone, talking to someone with a set jaw and a watch that could have bought a car. Michael stood at the edge of the lawn, hands in his pockets, looking out as if there were an ocean rather than a row of hedges. I touched his arm. He turned, and I saw it all. The boy standing at the end of the driveway in his small suit on his first spring band concert night, the man about to be a father himself if the world was kind, the child and the choice and the present all folded into him. "You okay?" he asked. I smiled. "I've been worse." He looked at me, and in that look was a kind of apology I didn't need and a kind of pride I did. "You did right," he said softly, and it was more than about the roadside. Arthur found me then with Emily at his elbow. "Patricia," he said, "I hope you'll forgive me if I put you a little further out front." He held something in his hand, a small envelope with my name in black ink, not calligraphy but clean, the kind of penmanship that looks you in the eye. "This is not the fund," he smiled. "That will take lawyers and meetings and the patience of saints. This is—" He hesitated, as if choosing a word was like choosing a tie. "This is gratitude." I took it. It had weight. Money has a way of giving paper heft. For a second, the rooms of my childhood opened again. The rent envelopes, the careful way my mother folded the cash, the way my father would have whistled low and said, "Well, I'll be." I didn't open it. Some things you need to meet in private. Cynthia called for attention then, her voice ringing with that particular brightness she uses as a bell. "Friends," she said, back in the ballroom voice. "We have another little moment, and then coffee on the patio. Arthur?" She gestured with all the graciousness that comes from practice and posture. "You said you had a word?" He did. He spoke well, as people like him are taught and expected to do. He spoke about the morning, about kindness, about ordinary people making days extraordinary. He held the room like a good teacher catches the attention of 25 children with a story about a frog. He said my name like it belonged in his mouth as much as any of theirs. There was applause again, honest now in some places, perfunctory in others. What followed was messier, it always is. People came up to me with their versions of thanks and congratulations, with offers to connect me to their cousin who ran a charity, to their neighbor who was looking for a committee member, to their own need to be near a small blaze as if they could warm their hands. Cynthia stood a little apart, smiling, not rigid, but not relaxed. In her eyes, something had been interrupted. I know what it is to have your own choreography thrown by a new step. You can either learn it, or you can spend the rest of the routine with your jaw set. "Michael," she said later, under her breath, but not far enough to not be heard. "Your mother will need to—" And then she stopped because Emily had put her hand on her wrist gently. Emily is learning too. Sometimes influence passes slips of paper between ladies' rooms and patio chairs, and you never see the handoff, but you feel the shift. I tucked Arthur's envelope into my purse and felt its rectangle against the lining, like a secret. I looked out over the lawn where a breeze had started, soft enough to lift the napkins at the edges. It made the candle flames tilt, not go out. I thought of the card in my purse that morning, the cream one with his name, and of the pen I would use to write a note that afternoon on my own modest stationery with a spray of blueberries in the corner. I thought of the fund he had spoken of and the children whose coats would be zipped because someone had a little left over that month. I thought of the way Cynthia's voice had hung that first sentence of the day over the room like a chandelier, the kind that looks permanent until someone decides to take it down. There is a reckoning coming, not dramatic, not a shouting match. Rooms like these don't do shouting. They do cuts that are so clean you don't know you've bled until you see the stain. But it is coming, in the shape of choices about where Michael and Emily spend their holidays, about whose table they'll sit at and whose expectations they'll politely decline. It is coming in the shape of a fund with my name on it. For once my name not just on a school roster or a sign-up sheet, but on something that says decency counts in a ledger that isn't mean or small. It is coming in the shape of my own spine, which has learned, late but well, the curve it was supposed to have all along. As the party thinned and people drifted toward the driveway, where cars waited at attention under the watchful eye of a valet who looked like he might still need help tying a tie, I stood by the hydrangeas and let the sound of everyone else's lives wash by. The gardenias breathed their evening breath, a little less insistent, a little more forgiving. Arthur stood near the gate, his cane tapping a friendly beat on the stone. He lifted his hand. "I'll call you," he said. "We'll have coffee, in Norwalk. You can introduce me to your basil." He smiled. "You'll tell me which school doors to knock on first." "Okay," I said. It came out both like a yes and a thank you, which is fitting, because often they are the same thing. Cynthia's porch light blinked on, one of those chandeliers with too many crystals, and it threw bits of light onto the lawn, the way fireworks do when they're almost done. People glow in that light if you let yourself see them. In that light, even Cynthia is just a woman in a beautiful dress holding tightly to the idea that control can save you from the unexpected. In that light, I am just a woman who stopped her car on the post road and kneels easily, who knows how to spread a picnic blanket on gravel so it doesn't pick up too much of the ground. I walked down the steps with Michael beside me, Emily catching up behind, her hand tucked into the crook of my elbow. The night air met us, and I breathed it like a promise. I didn't feel triumph, I felt steadiness. I felt like I had stepped out of one story and into another, one where my habit of stopping was not a liability to be softened at the edges by someone else's smile, but a line in my own ledger that I could look at when the world made me small. At the curb, I checked my purse for my keys and felt the envelope again. I thought about opening it under the street lamp's cone of light, but some things deserve your kitchen table, The quiet of your own chair, the basil in the window, and the clock on the stove ticking it steady. I thought about writing a note on my blueberry stationery with the words, "Thank you for seeing me," because that is what gratitude really is. Not a check, though those help. It's being seen across a room where you once felt invisible and being called by your name in a voice that says it without a smile that cuts it. We got in the car. Michael buckled and looked over at me, his boy body long gone but his boy smile there for a second. "You ready?" he asked. "More than," I said, and I turned the key. The engine caught the way it always has. We pulled away from the curb, the house receding in the rear view, the gardenias, the porch, the chandelier still doing its best. The night had softened by then, the world just a little kinder than it had to be, the road home exactly where it has always been, waiting for people like me who stop and start again. That night, I set the envelope on my kitchen table and let it sit there like a visitor I wasn't quite ready to greet. The basil on the windowsill lifted its little green heads as if curious too. I put on the kettle, which is how I steady myself, and watched the steam rise in the shape of all my years. The stove clock hummed softly. The condo was as quiet as a library after hours. I thought about opening the envelope then, under the yellow pool of the table lamp. But something in me wanted the moment to be about more than paper and numbers. I wanted to be sure I would remember how it felt when someone said thank you in a way that reached all the way to the mornings in the school office and the nights my boy and I ate cereal and called it a treat. I pulled open the drawer where I keep my napkins and my checkbook and the little oddities that have never found a better home, and I took out the bell. It is a small brass thing with a wooden handle, the kind of bell teachers used in old movies. When Mrs. Strickland retired, she put it in my hand and said, "You've always known how to call a room to attention without raising your voice. Keep this, Mrs. P. It's your magic." I had kept it because it felt wrong to throw away a voice. Over the years, I rang it in the school hallways when the line of first graders looked like it might wiggle into the street, and every time it worked, not because of the sound, but because of the memory attached to it. The children knew it meant someone saw them, someone was holding the rope at the edge of the pool. I set the bell next to the envelope. The two of them looked like opposites at first, old and new, wait and promise. But in that moment they began to feel like the same thing. The world handing me tools again, telling me gently that it might not be done with me after all. The tea hissed when I poured it. I pulled out my blueberry stationery and wrote to Arthur in my careful hand, "Thank you for seeing me." I told him I would meet him for coffee wherever he liked, that I wanted to help ask the right questions at the schools, that I had a bell that would be perfect for reminding rooms to listen to the people who do the quiet work. Halfway through signing my name, the phone rang. I knew the number by heart because in the months since the wedding, Cynthia's name had a way of lighting up my phone at the exact moments when the day was most at peace. I took a breath, put the bell back into the drawer, and picked up. "Patricia," she trilled, as if we were old friends. "What an evening." "It was," I said. I kept my voice warm because my mother always said kindness is a coat that fits in every season and every house. "Arthur, can you imagine? We're still all aflutter." She laughed in a way that made me think of a flag waving at itself. "How are you? No more coffee spills?" I was mortified. "I'm fine," I said. "Thank you for the cloth." "We must debrief," she went on. "So many moving parts. I'm having a small planning brunch on Sunday at the club, Round Hill, just a few core ladies," she added, which is one of those phrases that can make you feel like they're about to pick teams and you might be called last. "We want to finalize showers and the nursery registry and, oh, a little charity component. You know I believe in giving back." Her voice softened just a hair. "And there seems to be interest from the Greenwich time. They heard Arthur popped in and they're doing a feel-good piece. They've asked for a quote or two. We'll make sure you're included," she fluttered, which sounded both like inclusion and like permission. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the envelope. "Sunday," I repeated. "I can come." "Wonderful. 10 o'clock, pastels. They take a hard line on denim." She laughed softly. "One more thing, Patricia. If you could send me your lemon bar recipe, the caterer adored them. We'll have them replicate your homey touch." Save you the trouble, darling. The word darling doesn't sit well on me when it's not Emily saying it. I like making them, I said. It's not trouble. Oh, but we must save you for things that don't require an apron, she said with a kindness that had edges. We will need someone to head the favors committee. You have a knack for bows and little notes, I can tell. It's all in the details. And when the baby comes, we'll coordinate. I've already spoken to Emily about getting a night nurse for the first month. After that, we'll see about schedules. Michael mentioned you're free most weekdays. Perhaps Saturdays with Nana? We don't want to overtax you. I pictured a whiteboard with my name in dry erase marker under the heading Help. My heart did the polite thing and stayed where it was. We'll all figure it out together, I said. Of course, she sang. That's what families do. See you Sunday, Patricia. Not Patty, not Mrs. P. She hung up without the soft little latency people put at the end when they're not quite ready to stop being in your ear. When the phone went quiet, I took the bell back out of the drawer. I held it in my palm and remembered the way children's faces shift when they realize someone is about to say something that might matter. I decided right then that I would bring it with me Sunday. It felt foolish and right at the same time, like packing a raincoat just because you don't trust the clouds. The next morning, a note slid under my door. A thick cream card with a careful script. Arthur's driver, it said. If you're free, join me at the Circle Diner in Fairfield at 11. Coffee's better there than any place with a chandelier. I laughed out loud for the first time since the party. The Circle Diner has booths that have seen everything and keep their counsel. I drove up the post road with the bell tucked into my tote, its weight a quiet secret against my shoulder blade. Arthur was already in a booth like any other man on his second cup, a newspaper folded into itself on the Formica. He looked smaller without his suit and bigger without his context. Patricia, he said, and the way he said my name cleared a little space around us where no pretense could sit. We talked about the fund first because that's what we both wanted to talk about. The assistant, he chuckled. She wants to call it the Bellamy Foundation for Everyday Excellence. It sounds like a toothpaste. He shook his head. I have a bell, I said, and put it on the table between us. He laughed in surprise and then smiled as if he had been given a weather vane. The Bell Fund, he said slowly. Not for me, for what it means. For the people who know how to get a room to listen without shouting. And for small things, I said. Because it's small things that make big mornings bearable. He nodded, and his eyes turned a little glassy. The Bell Fund it is. He scribbled on a napkin like a boy making a plan after school. We will create microgrants for school secretaries, nurses, cafeteria staff, crossing guards. They'll apply with 2 paragraphs, no essays, no recitals of suffering. Maybe we ask the principals to nominate quietly, I said. And we make the first ones in Norwalk. No press, just a check and a handshake. He looked at me over his readers. There is one wrinkle, he said. Cynthia rang me this morning. She was pitch perfect. Her mother had a generous heart, she said. She believes in honoring legacies. She would like to help by hosting an announcement Sunday. She suggested we name the fund after her mother. I told her I'd think. I would prefer not to think alone. We let the coffee do its work. I watched the waitress refill his cup with the kind of grace that deserves a grant. If the fund is about everyday courage, I said, maybe it should carry the name of the everyday thing that holds a room in a school without a chandelier, not a person who's already got a portrait in a foyer. He smiled, and there was mischief in it. Would you be comfortable if, when we're all in our pastel glory, we announced the Bell Fund? And would you be comfortable if we did not name it in anyone's honor, including yours? I thought about the envelope on my table and the bell in my bag. I would be more than comfortable. He stirred his coffee with unnecessary focus. I watched Cynthia last night, he said. She is very good at seeing other people's light and putting a lampshade on it that matches her decor. Sunday, let's give her something beautiful and unshaded. If you want it. I laughed softly. I have a bell, I said again. I know how to call a room, even if they were taught not to hear me. He lifted his cup, to the bell and its bearer. Sunday at the Round Hill Club is the kind of quiet that is paid for. Golf carts hum like bees on the far side of the hedges, and inside the windows, women in dresses that never wrinkle sit on chairs that would never dare. I parked where they told me to park, which was further than my legs would have chosen, and walked in with my tote on my shoulder and my bell wrapped in a lemon-yellow napkin. The foyer had baskets of hydrangeas, as if hydrangeas grew money and they were harvesting. "Patricia," the woman at the desk said after a long blink. "Cynthia's in the East Room." She said East Room the way some people say Tiffany, and I almost smiled. When I arrived, the tables were set up with index cards and little bowls of pastel almonds and vases full of roses, like a fairy tale tried to sit on a spreadsheet. I saw a binder on one side with a label maker's neatness, "Baby Calendar." A smaller binder below it read, "Photos." A stack of monogrammed aprons sat on a chair. I did not laugh. I chose a seat near the window, where the light belonged more to the outside world than to the lamps. Cynthia arrived looking effortless in a silk dress that might have been made from the April sky. "There you are," she said to me and kissed the air near my cheek. "We have so much to do. I've taken the liberty of drawing up a little plan. Just guidelines, of course." "Of course." She began with gifts. There were categories: learning toys, sustainable wooden animals, French language books, as if a baby could absorb a new tongue with the right paint. There were sign-up sheets for hospital meals and one for grandmother contributions, a phrase that made my stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with butterflies. "We thought, Patricia," she said, and the way we included me felt like a hallway with a low ceiling. "You would be wonderful on the meals committee and later as our diaper angel. You're so organized." "Of course," I said, "because I am, and because being organized is a kind of love." "And of course we'll keep a schedule," she continued. She lifted the baby calendar binder like a holy text. "No drop-ins. It keeps everyone sane. My house is always open," she added quickly, to soften that door swinging shut. "But we want to be fair to Emily as well," ladies murmured. Someone with an ice blue manicure nodded, as if this were wisdom she could build a porch on. "We don't want to spook the nanny," another woman said, and everyone laughed gently. I looked down at my lap and saw the bell's outline under the napkin. I thought about the school office and the way we organized chaos without a binder. Messages pinned to bulletin boards with wobbly pushpins, a whiteboard with a handwriting only I could read, a phone that never stopped ringing. We had a schedule too. We just also had humanity, which is messier. "Before we dive into streamers," Cynthia said, "a quick note about last night." Her eyes slid to me and then away. "We are so lucky to live in a community where we support one another. Arthur has expressed interest in doing something lovely in honor of my late mother, Anne. She adored the schools. We thought perhaps, if everyone agrees, we might announce a scholarship at the shower for a young lady of exceptional character. The press could cover the announcement, a little photo of the grandmothers-to-be, a note about family values. We do want to guide the narrative responsibly, given the interest." Her gaze perched on my shoulder and then flitted off, as if I were a bird that might make a noise at the wrong time. I saw it then, naked as a table before you set plates, the thrust of it. An event dressed like kindness, with me as the note in the corner, a flourish to prove the story's goodness. It wasn't new. It was the same shape as 100 other moments. "Here's your apron. Here's your corner. Thank you for your smallness." It wasn't hateful. In some ways, it was worse. It was warm and controlling, a hug that lifts your feet without your permission. My heart thumped once, politely, and then I felt the heat rise in my chest, the way it does when you are finally done being folded smaller than you are built for. I thought of the coffee stripe on my lap, the way Cynthia dabbed at me as if she were keeping stain from moving where it didn't belong. I thought of the way the lemon bars were cut into pieces too neat for their origin, the way my name was placed near the kitchen door. I thought of the seersucker man and the word Good Samaritan said, like a suit you put on for a photo. I thought of the binder on the table and the word schedule wrapped around a love that doesn't need to be slotted in to be real. Arthur arrived late and on purpose. He carries his lateness like a note held just a little longer in a song you know by heart. He smiled at the room in that way of his, a warmth that does not apologize for itself. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "Not at all," Cynthia replied, already angling her chair so a photographer would have her good side if one materialized. "We were just planning." He sat not beside her, as the room wanted him to, but in the empty chair at the table near me. He looked down and saw the bell under my napkin. He nodded very slightly, like someone responding to a hymn. Cynthia lifted her chin. "Before we choose ribbon colors," she said, "I think now would be lovely." Her tone brightened. "Arthur?" Arthur stood. He spoke with his hands folded over the back of the chair in front of him, as if to tell everyone he was going to have a conversation, not deliver a decree. He told them about the roadside again, but he kept it small, like a correct story should be. He didn't lean on words dressed in tuxedos. He said we stop for one another because that is what keeps the world from slipping. He said some thanks cannot be said with place settings. He said he wanted to start something that would make sure small acts have long echoes. He cleared his throat. "I have decided," he went on, with the help of someone who knows more about the workings of a school day than I ever will, to begin the Bell Fund. He looked at me, and then at Cynthia, and then at the hydrangeas in the window, as if to include the outside world in the agreement. "It will give small grants to the people who make our children's days steady and safe. It will not be named for me. And, if she will allow, it will be stewarded in its first year by Patricia." The room grew that quiet again, the kind that is not empty, but attentive. It was the quiet I've missed since I left the hallway with its scuffed floors. Not everyone smiled. There's a certain kind of person who doesn't know what to do with applause if it's not choreographed for them. But most women nodded, a few clapped. One woman, whose nails weren't ice blue at all but natural and short, wiped her eye as if she'd gotten a piece of dust in it. Cynthia's face did something I recognized, because I have watched my own do it in mirrors. The quick recalibration that comes when the dance changes mid-song. She smiled, and it was a good one. "What a charming idea," she said. "Anne would be thrilled. And of course the club will be delighted to advertise tickets to the charity luncheon." "It won't be ticketed," Arthur said gently. "It will be quiet. That's the point." He smiled at her in a way that allowed her to save face, but also put a hand over the pot before it boiled. Cynthia nodded so slowly you could have measured the room with it. "Of course," she said again, and this time, less of course and more "I hear you." All of that would have been enough to make a morning. But the world had one more thing to add. A woman I hadn't seen before sat down in the chair to my left and opened a small notebook. "Tiffany Johnson," she murmured, holding out a card. "Greenwich time." I took it and felt the oldest part of me, the one who believes in words on paper, stir. She lifted her pen. "Can I get a quote from you, Patricia?" She pronounced my name like she was checking how it sounded in her mouth. Cynthia leaned in smoothly. "We're all thrilled," she said. "The community—" "May I said, and I surprised myself. I reached into my tote and took out the bell wrapped in the yellow napkin. When I held it, the room thinned almost imperceptibly, as if someone had opened a window. It wasn't magic. It was memory. I stood. I didn't intend to. My legs stood for me the way they used to when a mother didn't come on time for pickup and someone needed to be the sign that the day was still under control. I put the bell down on the white tablecloth. It made the softest sound, a little thunk made more noticeable by the way our ears wait for metal and got wood. I looked at Cynthia, then at Arthur, then at the reporter and all the ladies with their pens ready for ribbon colors. I used to ring this at the school when the hallway got so loud that children couldn't hear their own names, I said. My voice didn't shake. It came out the way my mother's did when she would tell you to be home by dark, and you knew she meant it, not because she was going to scold you, but because she was going to worry and wear a path in the rug. And then everyone, kids, teachers, visitors, would turn and look. Not because the bell was loud. It's not. But because they knew it meant something was being asked of them. Attention, kindness, a minute of the time that they thought belonged only to them. No one moved. Not even the almond bowls. I didn't stop for Arthur because anyone was watching, I said. I stopped because my hands have learned that sometimes they're needed by someone who isn't going to ask. And last night, when I walked into a room that was beautiful and bright and very sure of itself, I felt the old feeling. I felt like a second bell was being rung at me by people who wanted to keep things as lovely as they had arranged. It's a powerful bell, that one. It says there is a place for you, and here it is, next to the kitchen door. A laugh fluttered and died before it got started. I am grateful that Arthur is here today. I am honored that he wants to do something that will help the people I love. But I also need to say something else, and I'll say it into the face of this gorgeous room. I looked at Cynthia's hand where it rested on the baby calendar binder, at her careful fingers, at the way she holds a life like it's a plan and a promise. I will not be assigned like an item on a list to the first weeks of my grandchild's life. I will not be handled. I will bring lemon bars to every holiday you'll have me at, and I will bring good words when Emily is tired and the baby is crying and nothing in the binder helps. I will sit up at 2 a.m. if asked, without reservation, because that's where my love lives. It is not a shift to be logged. It is not a favor to be kept score of. It is mine to give, not yours to schedule. The reporter had stopped writing. Women around the table had their heads tilted like children when a story is taking a turn. My voice stayed calm because I have practiced it in rooms where children were crying and adults forgot how to speak softly. And while I am saying things out loud, I went on, because when you start, it's best to finish. I would like it to be known that I have felt very small in these rooms for a very long time. I have felt like my presence was only as valuable as my punctuality and my willingness to stand near the dishwasher. I do not need chandeliers to see. I have the hallway. I have the late bell. I have a boy who grew up and turned into a man who looks to me when rooms get fuzzy. I have a woman sitting next to me. I reached across and touched Emily's hand where she had slipped into the chair at some point without me noticing. Who is going to be a mother, and who needs us to be grown-ups who help without needing to be seen helping? I picked up the bell. It made a soft little kiss of sound against my fingers. So here's my plan, I said, and the words tasted like something I'd been cooking a long time. We will launch the Bell Fund quietly. We will do it in Norwalk first, because sometimes the places people drive past are the places where things get fixed. We will give checks in envelopes without speeches. And at the shower, I looked at the binder and then at Cynthia. We will open gifts and laugh and write thank you notes and take pictures of Emily with bows in her hair like a silly hat, and we will not call a reporter. We will be what we say we are, a family. I turned to Cynthia, not to scold, but because 2 women in a room deserve to look each other in the eye when decisions are made. I understand you are very good at this, I said. Your events are beautiful. Your food tastes like postcards. You know how to make people feel like their best selves. I ask you to add one more skill to your tray. Make a space where no one has to prove they belong. The room was very, very quiet. So quiet I could hear the golf carts outside like bees again. Then someone, ice blue nails, put her hand on the table and said softly, "Amen." It fluttered around like a bird that had been trying to get out and finally found a window. Another woman clapped, just once, like she had never done it before without waiting for someone to start. Then the room remembered how to breathe, and there were nods and a few yeses, and in the corner, a small applause that sounded like rain beginning. Cynthia's throat moved. She is not a villain, I know that. She is a woman who has learned a way of being useful and admired in the only language that made sense in the rooms she was taught in. I watched that language slide around in her mouth, looking for a new word. She closed the binder carefully, the way you close a book you intend to read again, but not this minute. "You are right," she said finally, and did not add a qualifier. She lifted her eyes to mine. "I'm sorry I made you feel small. I hadn't expected it, and it knocked against something soft in me." "Thank you," I said, because I have learned to allow apologies a chair. Arthur reached over and tapped the bell with one knuckle. "That," he said, "was the best use of a bell I've ever witnessed, and I watched Wimbledon in '84. We laughed. It let the air back in. The reporter cleared her throat. "I can write about a fund that wants to be quiet," she said, a bit sheepish. but perhaps not with a full-page photo. Write about a bell, I said, half joking and half not. People who listen will find it. We did choose ribbon that day, pale yellow to match the napkin I had wrapped the bell in. We wrote out tasks in pencil instead of ink. The word schedule stayed, but it moved to a page where everyone could see it and no one's name was under a heading that sounded like a job. The monogrammed aprons were redistributed to the caterers with the promise that we'd wear them together after the shower when we brought casseroles to someone's mother recovering from hip surgery. At the end, when the room had loosened and the index cards were stacked neatly and the almonds had been sampled, Cynthia came over with something in her hand. "For you," she said. It was one of the aprons, but there was no monogram. It was simple, with a deep pocket. "Not for a job," she added quickly. "For lemon bars that you bring because you want to, and because they disappear fastest." I put the bell into the pocket and felt it there against my hip, a small weight that belonged to me. Emily slid in under my arm and rested her head on my shoulder. "That was something," she whispered, "which is how you thank someone for keeping your life from being determined by the loudest person in the room." On the way out to the parking lot, Michael caught up with me, jogging, his tie askew, because no matter how well he is taught, his tie will always wander. "You okay?" he asked. He asks me that now with a tenderness he learned the hard way. "I think so," I said. "I think the room heard a bell." He laughed. We walked under the white sky together. That evening, I finally opened Arthur's envelope at my kitchen table. Inside was a check, yes, but wrapped in it, as if he knew I would look first at him and not at his bank, was a note. "For the bell. For the rooms you'll change without anyone noticing the furniture moved. A." I cried then, the way you cry when the coffee is spilled and the stain comes out without you understanding how. I put the check back and tucked the note into the drawer next to the bell. We did launch the fund quietly. We stood in the hallway at Jefferson School with Mrs. Strickland, who tried to pretend she was mad at me for making her cry and failed. We gave a check to the cafeteria manager at Fox Run for a new industrial can opener because theirs had a handle that slipped and took skin with it each morning. We paid for 2 pairs of winter boots that didn't leak. We slipped $500 across a desk to a school nurse who had been using her own paycheck to stock inhalers for children whose insurance renewals were lost somewhere behind a voicemail. We did it in small rooms, at little desks, with a bell sitting on the corner like a promise to listen. There were no chandeliers. There were bulletin boards with crooked borders. At the shower 2 weeks later, there were bows in Emily's hair, and yes, lemon bars that went first. I wore the apron in the kitchen while I plated them with a girl who was working her way through nursing school and who taught me exactly how to slide them onto the tray so the powdered sugar didn't cloud. We took pictures, and none of them were staged to sell anything. At the end, when the gifts were open and the cards were saved and the world had been made a little softer by tiny socks and baby blankets knitted by hands with skin like silk, Cynthia lifted a glass with grace that had learned a new step. "To the people who show up," she said, "on time or late, in flats or in heels, with lemon bars or with a bell." I smiled and raised my glass. I caught my reflection in a window and saw the outline of my mother's mouth when someone had done something right, and she didn't want to cry. Later, when we were gathering plates and laughing in the kitchen, and one of the servers was telling me about her son's science project with a pride that made my chest warm, I slipped the bell out of my apron pocket. I turned it in my fingers. I didn't ring it. I didn't need to. I set it on the counter, a small note in a room that finally sounded like a song I knew the words to. On Monday, I drove to the school with a box of envelopes and a roll of stamps with birds. I delivered the first 5 letters of the Bell Fund to people who had not asked for them. I watched each face move the way faces move when the world is kinder than they thought it would be that day. And when I walked back to my car, the post road smelled like gasoline and cut grass and my basil when it gets bruised. There was a Bentley ahead of me at a red light, a different one from the day by the park, and I smiled because cars, like people, can be symbols or just a way to get to the next place you need to be. I am not interested in winning rooms anymore. I am interested in calling them to attention when something needs saying and being the kind of person who will keep walking until she hears the right sound. I keep the bell in my purse now, next to my stamps and my aspirin and a folded-up picnic blanket that still has gravel dust in its threads from the shoulder of Route 1. Sometimes, late at night, when the condo is so quiet I can hear the ticking of the stove clock and the little exhale of my basil plant when I touch it, I take the bell out and set it on the table next to my chipped blue mug. It shines back at me in the lamplight, and I remember the room last Sunday and the hush and the way a life can change, not when you shout, but when you decide, quietly and finally, that you will be the one to ring. That you will be the one to ring. For a beat, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if the bell had actually sounded and then been swallowed. Then something else happened, smaller and truer than the polite applause Cynthia was so good at orchestrating. Women began to look at one another not as opponents in a social drill, but as people who might be able to do something together without rehearsal. There was a softness that slid into the edges of the room, like sunlight finding a place on the carpet. Cynthia folded the baby calendar closed with a care that surprised me. It was the reverence you offer a book you'll reread but feel changed by now. She looked at me straight on. I have been on other sides of that look. When I needed something and didn't know how to ask, when someone older than me put an arm around my shoulders and steadied me without making a show. She said simply, "I'm sorry I made you feel small." And in the way she said it, I heard her meaning it. It wasn't a public performance. It was a small admission, offered like a cup of coffee when someone is cold. "Thank you," I said, because I have learned to accept apologies into the room like chairs. They sit down. They make the space livable again. Arthur tapped the bell with his knuckle like a conductor endorsing a new tempo, and then, as if relieved by something too, he said he'd like the fun to be quiet in its beginnings. No press, no fanfare. Grants from hand to hand. And I agreed. I wanted work to be the work, and not the lighting around it. We did pick ribbon that day, pale yellow, because it felt like the color of the napkin that had held the bell. We wrote lists in pencil so they could always be erased and rewritten. And Cynthia, who had been taught to set the world in order with menus and seating charts, surprised me again. She offered the apron without a monogram, saying she wanted it for me because lemon bars belonged to whoever loved to make them, not to the image they created. We left the Round Hill Club with our hands full of plans and our mouths a little raw from saying something true. Outside, the hedges shivered politely in the breeze and a golf cart hummed away like a mosquito with class. I kept the bell in my pocket like a talisman, feeling its edge against my hip as I walked to my car. My son walked with me a few paces, tie crooked because the day had been more important than his tie, and he told me in that careful voice he reserves for secrets that he was proud. He didn't add any qualifiers. That was all I needed. The first real work of the Bell Fund happened where there are no chandeliers and no press releases, at small offices and in kitchens with fluorescent lights. We started in Norwalk and the towns that touch it, Jefferson School, where Mrs. Strickland still keeps a jar of hard candies in a drawer because some things are better sweet than bitter. Fox Run Middle School, where the lunch line is a procession of elbows and stories. The clinic where the nurse's cabinet was plundered by families trying to keep kids breathing through winter. We wrote checks, and we didn't hand them to a podium. We slipped envelopes across counters. We shook hands. We listened. There was a woman at Fox Run, Marisol, who ran the cafeteria like a captain. Her industrial can opener had a handle that split fingers. She would tape it together every morning and keep stirring as if the world had asked her to stay invisible. We bought her a new opener and a set of pans that didn't scream when they were stacked. She cried when we pressed the envelope into her hand, not because of the money, though it helped, but because someone had seen the work behind the steam. She hugged me like I was a person who had been found. I hugged back and felt the bell in my apron pocket thump like a little heart. Another morning we paid for boots. 2 boys in the after-school club had shoes that soaked through in a drizzle. Their socks were always a little sad. When the boots were handed out, the smaller one looked at us like we just rearranged the world so that his feet would not leak. He ran outside and stomped in a puddle as if to test a promise, I stood at the doorway and watched him because that little stomp felt like an answer to a prayer I didn't know I'd prayed. Arthur kept his word about quietness. He called me on a Tuesday to say contracts were in order, that the paperwork would be simple, that the trustee would be practical. He did not want his name on a plaque. He wanted a ledger that did good without applause. He also called me, sometimes, to ask which door to knock on because he knew my list, the names of people who made children's days easier. I would tell him, and he would go, often in his own old, quiet way. A phone call, a visit, a check signed, and an envelope closed. He learned with a delight that suited him that some of the loudest joy sneaks up on you in a small office at 3 p.m. when the school secretary leans back in her chair and breathes for the first time that week. People began to notice in the way people notice when the rhythm of something changes, not by gazing at a chandelier, but by the way a parent thanks a crossing guard by name, by the cafeteria worker who could buy a new pair of shoes and smiled with a relief that looked like a small holiday. The Greenwich Time did run a short piece, about a bell, it said, and about a fund that preferred envelopes to headlines. It was quiet, and that suited us. Cynthia read it and phoned to say that she'd never read anything so warm and so unassuming. We were a little heroic there for a minute, she admitted, and then let out a laugh like someone who has tacked a new stitch into an old seam. Emily became a mother in late October on a rainy Thursday. Labor can be comedic and holy at once, and that day it was both. I stayed, but not scheduled in any roster, because that is how love works with me. I sat on the hospital chair while Michael paced and argued with himself on the phone, and then smiled when his daughter arrived and the world calibrated itself differently. When the nurses brought a cup of terrible hospital coffee, I drank it as a sacrament because it meant I was present. I held the baby while Emily napped, and I smelled the top of her head and remembered the day she came home from the hospital 30 years late and everyone had written furiously on cards, and I had thought the world was small enough to hold her. This time, the room felt exactly large enough. There were no schedules tucked under the mattress, no lists pinned on a board. There were hugs and casseroles and friends whose faces had names now instead of titles. Cynthia came by to deliver a casserole she'd organized with a committee, and she surprised me by staying long enough to meet the baby and then staying longer still to help wash dishes. She did not make a speech. She dried pans with the concentration of someone who had learned to value the work of smaller hands. She leaned across the counter and said quietly, "She did it so well." I heard in her voice an acceptance of the ordinary miracle that is a child born into ordinary hours and extraordinary love. We stood at the sink and talked about the things that had once seemed unchangeable. She asked me, honestly, not as a social test, how I wanted to be involved, not what slot on the schedule I'd like, but whether I wanted to sit and read, to bring lemon bars on holidays, to be called at 2 a.m. if the baby needed someone who'd fold things into quiet. I told her what I wanted, the permission not to be managed like a task. That day, walking home with a casserole container still warm in my tote, I felt lighter than I had in a long while. It wasn't that everything had changed. The post road still had its potholes, and the bakery still charged too much for an almond croissant. But the geometry of some things had shifted. Rooms that used to ask me to be small were learning how to include me without sizing me. People who had been content to applaud from the bleachers were learning to go into low-lit rooms and hand out envelopes and hooks for coats. The bell remained a constant in the pocket of my apron and then my purse. I began to use it in small ways. At Jefferson School, when the hallway got loud and the children needed to line up, I would ring it once, soft, a question, and the corridor would turn. The sound was not dramatic. It was a note that said, "Listen." Teachers began to tell me they could see the difference in the way children answered to a small sound that meant something was being asked of them. Once, when a child came to the office clutching a note that needed to be delivered to a mother who did not have minutes, I used the bell to call a short meeting of 5 staff members, and in 20 minutes a ride appeared, and a lunch was saved. The bell sat on Mrs. Strickland's desk like a pebble of promise. Months later, at a small luncheon we held, no press of course, we put a modest plaque into the fund's tiny ledger and sent out letters with stamps bearing birds. People came in sneakers and sensible flats to accept envelopes that would buy winter coats or help a nurse replace a nebulizer. There were tears and laughter and food that tasted like gratitude. Cynthia gave a short speech, not because she needed to be seen, but because she had found something that mattered beyond a table's decor. She said, "I thought I knew how to help. I didn't know I was only learning." The women around the table clapped in a way that felt like hands sliding over a piano. They meant the sound to make music, not noise. I found my life increasingly centered on small rituals. I taught a literacy circle once a week in the library, slowly turning pages with children who had never seen a library card with their own name on it. I baked lemon bars and brought them to neighborhood gatherings. I kept my stamps and my bell and my aspirin in the same pocket. I learned to move between different rooms with the same attention. The school, the hospital, my own kitchen where basil still raised its green face to the light. Each place asked for the same thing, someone to notice, to do the small thing that keeps the larger machine from seizing. There are moments of reconciliation that are not cinematic, but quiet. One afternoon, a year after the party, Cynthia stopped by my condo with a pie that had been too large for one household. She left it on my porch and knocked, as if to make the exchange ceremonious. We sat on my little stoop and split the pie with plastic forks. Her hands were not perfectly manicured that day. There was soil under her nails from a new habit of planting herbs in the club's courtyard. She told me, without preamble, that she'd been reading the notes the fund had received, handwritten thank yous from crossing guards, a picture of a child in new boots, and that seeing those faces had changed the way she thought about service. "I like being useful," she said, "but I see now that it's different when you let the people you help decide what useful looks like." She laughed, the sound quieter than her party laugh, but truer. I told her the bell made it easier to hear. She pretended not to understand the metaphor, and then cupped her hands like someone trying to hold the small sound and said simply, "Call me if you need an extra pair of hands." I kept the bell on my kitchen table for a long time, near my chipped blue mug, where it caught the lamplight like a coin. Sometimes in the evenings, when the condo is quiet and my basil sighs at my touch, I will pick it up and run my thumb along its wood. The bell is not only a tool, it is a metaphor that fits inside my palm. The idea that a small sound can be the beginning of attention, that attention can bloom into care, and that care has the strange habit of being contagious. There are days still when I arrive late to things that matter and nothing dramatic happens, just a chuckle and a reshuffle of chairs. There are other days when stopping a car on Route 1 seems an ordinary decision that stretches into a life I did not expect to live. When I drive by the Veterans Park now and see a Bentley parked on the grass, I don't think of wealth or spectacle. I think of a man who smelled of eucalyptus and of a day that taught me how to find the right people to love my town in small ways. Arthur and I still meet, coffee at the Circle Diner when the paper is thin and the eggs are generous. And we plan small grants and listen to the waitress's son tell us his science project idea. He is older now and a little slower with his hands, but his smile still opens rooms. What feels most like freedom is not the fund itself but the unlearning I did, the letting go of the idea that my worth is measured by my appearance at a door on time or by how neatly I fit into someone else's schedule. The bell taught me that calling a room to attention can be an act of community, not a performance. I learned that service is not a tally but a habit, and that habits like herbs flourish when tended. The bell sits in my apron pocket when I go to the school, in my tote when I carry casseroles, on the dresser when I iron a shirt for a son who still needs an arm around his shoulders sometimes. Its sound is small, but the echo it leaves is not about noise. It is about asking people to listen. That question alone changes the shape of a room. So here's what I've come to: a life of small rings, of some late arrivals, and some well-timed hands. The chandelier at Cynthia's house still glitters. I don't have anything against chandeliers, but I know now that light is not a thing you hang. It's a thing you share. A bell is a way of saying, quietly and without claiming the spotlight, hear this, care for this, show up. It is, in its smallness, a way to make the world kinder, one soft sound at a time. If this story touched you, If you've ever stopped for someone on the shoulder of the road or had your life nudged by an unexpected kindness, please leave a comment below to tell me about it. Share a moment where being late changed everything, or where a small favor set something right. If you found comfort here, tap the heart and subscribe so more stories about ordinary courage can find a place to land. We need more people who will ring the bell and more ears that will answer when it does. We don't need chandeliers to light the path. Sometimes a bell will do.